Was it
Yeah.
Genie in a Bottle by Christina Aguilera?
Chicken bake.
Well, because that that makes me reflect too.
Way to go, Smalls.
The Witness Box, the Thinking Person's podcast, where we explore true crime cases past and present at the intersection of law, psychology, philosophy, and faith, and challenge even the most ardent true crime followers to do the same. I've produced thousands of shows, worked on dozens of podcasts. This one, by far, I'm the most proud of. You see, the three of us, myself, Dr. Gary, and Chris McDonough, we all come from different backgrounds, and we all bring something different to the table. Getting to know these two great men has been an honor, and I look forward to many more episodes. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Witness Box, everybody. I'm your host, Joshua Diaz, alongside, as always, Chris McDonough of the Interview Room and the Cold Case Foundation as well. Good to see you, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing great, Josh. Another great program ahead.
I'm excited about it. And Dr. Gary Heidnik, author of The New Evil. Dr. Gary is a forensic psychologist, among many other things. And make sure to check out his bio and Chris's bio in the description of this episode. If you have any questions about their credentials, they are top-notch folks. And today, what we're going to talk about are dates that matter. And Dr. Gary, I'm going to let you kind of explain that a little bit. We talked about it a little bit before we started, but dates that matter to, I would say, offenders.
One of the things that you start to realize the more you study violent crime, whether it's one-time murderers, serial killers, spree killers, mass murderers, is that you might have a certain personality, you might have a certain motive, you might have a certain fantasy structure, you might have opportunity, you might have means, but what you need is that event, that thing that sets the fire to the straw. And in forensics, we call that a precipitating factor or precipitating event, which is an event that dynamically represents the last straw for a person. And sometimes that date, that the date a person picks for a crime, when they're sort of thinking it through, where it isn't impulsive, but they've sort of plotted it. It could be that they pick a date that's highly symbolic, like killing people of whom you are jealous on Valentine's Day. Or it could be that the day activates you impulsively because you're feeling very lonely, like on your birthday or Christmas or something like that. But the reason it's so interesting is that sometimes crimes occur on significant dates, and we don't really pause and think about how they may have figured into the crime. For example, JonBenet Ramsey's death on Christmas Day, or Nicholas Cruz perpetrating the Parkland shooting on Valentine's Day, or the Columbine shootings occurring on Hitler's birthday. These are things that I think we have to pause and think about with regard to motive. And I think it'll make for a very fascinating discussion.
When you say, that we're going to talk about the significant things for Hitler's birthday, which there are many of those. And Chris, you kind of framed it up for us, dates that matter. How do you kind of feel about that as well, about the significance of somebody kind of coming to a breaking point of a certain day?
Yeah, so to dovetail into what, Dr. Bricato's talking about, there is in what we call a victimology, when you're doing the 10 filters of profiling, what you're looking for is the stressor events that may be around, the crime in of itself. Are there situations or circumstances that could have precipitated, this violence? And if so, you want to try to identify that. And so dates in of itself are very, very important because they could have, the significance, meaning that, Dr. Gary can talk about to a particular perpetrator. And I guess we could, we can start off with Cruz in Parkland. He selected Valentine's Day as as the day he was going to, kick off. So what does that tell us? If we were just to start with Valentine's Day, what does that tell us about the potential personality? And that's where guys like Dr. Bricado come in,
Well,
to sit down with them.
well, in the case of Cruz, who is somebody that was certainly included in the large study that we did at Columbia Medical Center of mass shooters of all mass murder, I had speculated at the time we were looking at that that the date was not a coincidence. Michael Stone and I were convinced that Valentine's Day was picked as a way of kind of ruining the holiday for people who were lucky or in love, who weren't lonely. And It turns out I recently just discovered that Cruz did confess to a psychologist that he intentionally picked that day because the idea was to mar it forever for the people in that school. Clearly, this is a person who was feeling um, jealous and unloved. And I think Valentine's Day does have a tendency to have that significance. Now, where I think Valentine's Day becomes very interesting with regard to contemporary crime is that Valentine's Day happens to be the day that the victims were discovered in the Delphi murders. And that is a point that has been inexplicably overlooked by many people who look at that case. I cannot accept that it is a coincidence that those two poor kids were found on Valentine's Day, and it tells you something about what may have been underlying the feelings of the person who needed to kill them. Wouldn't you say, Chris? It likely has a significance.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I think that's a really good observation that, here these two young ladies are, young girls are, lured potentially to that bridge by that one kid. What was his name?
Well,
Uh,
some people think he's involved, some people don't, but I think you're talking about
Keegan.
Ian Klein.
Keegan. That's right,
Right.
Keegan.
Some people hypothesize that, other people don't. It's complicated, but whatever happened there, that it looks like the intention may have been for them to be discovered on this day that is supposed to be associated with love and companionship, right? And then you find these two minors, brutalized in the most disgusting imaginable way, and that day is now going to have a very different significance.
I mean, the symbolism of it, right?
Well, that's the key. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have to kind of reverse engineer that, right, Gary? I mean, through a forensic analysis of why that particular date would have been chosen, even for those two. I mean, if we take Keegan out of the circle, to your point,
Right.
What else is going on and who is involved in that particular circle on that one. I mean, there are so many events going on, and that's the other thing. It's not just the day; it could be a specific type of event. I mean, we look at these, guys who try to kill people, in a mass way by driving their cars, into crowds during parades and that type of stuff. What's going on at the house? Do you think in the perpetrator, in their personality and their minds, that they're gearing up for these events? What kind of symptomology and type of feelings do you think they're particularly building up to?
Well, when you're talking about people who ram vehicles into people, we looked at that, at all methods of mass murder when we did the database. And one of the things that was very clear that we learned is that you're far less likely to have severe mental illness, including psychosis, characterized by psychosis, far less likely to be psychotic if you use a gun, even if you use other means and you've got a gun also. But when there's no gun at all and you just do something like ram a car, you're far more likely to be deeply disturbed, deeply psychiatrically ill. But there's a subgroup of people who are not psychiatrically ill, but who are not committing that offense for personal cause reasons. They're doing it because they see themselves as part of a kind of army. And so, like a terrorist organization, typical of them, the whole idea is that you want to attack a public event where there's going to be a mass casualty incident. It's going to ruin, perhaps symbolically, that event for people. It may be a patriotic event, a day that's associated with something that you hate as part of that organization. And the idea is that everybody's together having fun, and in that moment, they are sort of shown to be fools because you didn't know that death was right, creeping up behind, just that kind of thing. And so that I think those kind of people divide up into the very disturbed and the and angry types, and then the types that are kind of politically or motivated by a terrorist thing. And it's very cruel when it happens, because you can just imagine the pain, the number of people who don't die, the indiscriminate nature of it. It's very similar, like setting off a bomb. And what you tend to see is that with particularly people that are politically motivated or have at least a paranoid ideology, dates are very significant, because in their mind it's all about like leveling the playing field in that kind of way, right? So like for example, the Oklahoma City bombing,
Right.
right, was committed on a day, yes, a day that had political significance to him. And
Well,
that
he was
kind
also mad over the Waco thing.
that's correct. And the whole idea is they pick days that are symbolic, like as if they're holidays for their cause. Right. So for some people, the birthday of Hitler is like a significant event in their cause, in their belief system, and you have to honor or celebrate. It's also interesting that 420 has become the cannabis day, right? But it is Hitler's birthday, 420. It's
Yeah.
two kinds of things going on at the same time. But there are a remarkable number of horrendous events that occur on Hitler's birthday. I dread that day every year, because you never know what's going to happen. But what are your thoughts on this idea, Josh? Before we,
I've never really thought about when the Delphi case happened and they did end up finding Abby and Libby on Valentine's Day. And an interesting point too was that I know that one of the parents, I can't remember which one, chose to put her date of death as the day before and not on Valentine's Day for whatever reason that was, because they didn't know exactly, and but they had that option. So, but I always found that to be fascinating. But I also think that it's one of those things where if the day's ruined for me, it's going to be ruined for everybody, and I'm just going to ruin it.
that's right. Sour
You'll
grapes.
never be, you'll never be happy on this day again. Christmas, Easter, the people go after, synagogues during like Yom Kippur and stuff like that. And it's, you're completely correct on it when you're saying, well, they're just, sour grapes. That's kind of how I feel about it. But it's an interesting topic to broach. Absolutely.
Well, one very interesting offender that I talk about when I teach about this kind of idea is the serial killer Gary Heidnik. Now, Gary Heidnik was one of the killers that John Douglas used when working with Thomas Harris, the guy who wrote the Silence of the Lambs books, the Hannibal Lecter books, to help create the composite killer that became Buffalo Bill, right? So Buffalo Bill is based on three different people, right? He's based on Ted Bundy because he uses the ruse of putting on a cast, asking for help, and then attacking a woman, right? He's based on Ed Gein because he's making a woman's suit like Ed Gein, who was also the basis for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, etc. And the third was Gary Heidnik, because Gary Heidnik was the guy who kept the women in a pit in Philadelphia. And it's very, very interesting story. I'll give it to you quickly. You could read it in detail in the New Evil because he's a Category 22 case. But Gary Heidnik was really a kind of garden variety psychopath who had been brutalized as a boy for bedwetting. His father had always hanged him out the window by the ankles or hanged his wet bed because he was a bedwetter. He had enuresis. The father would hang the bed sheets out so people would mock him. And to kind of deal with it, to feel empowered again, he would kill small animals and then hang them. It was like a way of saying, like, I'm going to project onto the animals what was happening to me, right? And when he was older, he was a schemer, master schemer. He was always BSing the military so didn't have to serve. He could get money, whatever. He became a bishop of a fake church that he founded to make money. He was a kind of BS artist. And what wound up happening was he kept getting these like mail order brides and relationships and impregnating women, and they kept leaving him. And he was having a very hard time with this repeat abandonment. So he got this.
Go figure.
Yeah, right. Got this thought was a brilliant idea. And the brilliant idea was that he was going to start taking women from a home for the intellectually disabled, women who had IQs that were like, at a level where you couldn't take care of yourself at all. And he was going to trap them in a pit that he made in the basement. And he was going to sire a line of children that could never leave him. He was going to start a harem in the basement. And to drown out the noise of them screaming, he would blast music, which is the same thing you see in The Silence of the Lambs. Blast this very, very loud music. And what would happen is he'd go down there, he'd assault one in front of the others. He started to study methods of torture, how to punish them. And eventually, he even hangs one of the women till she dies, similar to what he was doing with the animals, fulfilling that fantasy. And this very interesting thing happens. One of the women in the pit, who is a woman that had been picked up that was more, she was more average in her intellect. She got this idea that she should pretend to be interested in him, to want to be his friend. And then he took her out of the pit and she started to engage in the torture. Then she eventually got her boyfriend and they caught this guy. And there's a reason I'm telling you this whole story. So when I wrote the book with Michael, I sat down and I laid out all the dates that he picked up as victims. And lo and behold, there's a pattern where it's always within a matter of days from a holiday or his birthday or a significant life event where he was abandoned or somebody walked away from him or the anniversary of one of those events. And so I said to Michael at the time, I postulated that people needed to think a little bit about the idea that a trigger for going out and trolling for a victim might be some event that re-humiliates a person or makes a person feel lonely or abandoned. And incidentally, that cycle, that symbolic cycle of the father hanging him and then him hanging the animals and then him hanging the woman was completed because when he was arrested, he hanged himself in prison.
Oh, interesting.
The cycle went around, and he survived it, and then he wound up enjoying boasting on talk shows about how he tortured women. I remember once an interviewer said to him, "Did it hurt when you hurt those?" And he said, "I hope so. It was supposed to." But it all peaked incidentally.
Instead of a reflection, huh?
Yeah, good reflection. Right. Well, you know what he was talking about? You know what he was talking about when he said that? That one day, just for his amusement, he filled the pit with water and snaked a live electric wire down there to zap all the women. And he was that cruel. Incidentally, with regard to this thing of the dates, I think that was really what sort of gave me this idea to start looking at it was this case, and I think you can see the symbolism of it because it was about loneliness. And fascinatingly, when they interviewed that woman who fooled him, I quoted this in The New Evil. They said to her, "How'd you know that he would fall for your tricks?" And she said, "I figured out he was lonely." See, and that's exactly the heart of it. That's exactly the heart of it. So I think in that kind of case, in that kind of psychology, the trigger is that over and over again, those events feel like they're mocking you. They exaggerate your isolation and your abandonment, and they're triggering events. And that's why when you see a pattern of serial killing and it sort of seems to cluster around a certain time of year or something, you get a really powerful clue of what the heck was going on in the perpetrator. What do you guys think about that idea?
I'm just wondering, are they killing themselves when, during the, because they have to basically recycle a new victim. They have to get somebody else. And I know that the part of the, the sexual fantasies, we got all that, right? We understand that stuff.
Oh, yes.
But, the randomness of the victimology and the selection process and all of this, help the viewer understand what is going on internally with these guys and gals. I mean, I guess we can talk about, women who have murdered and and in multiple sets. But what's going on between the female brain and the male brain?
Well, they have very different kinds of victims. I mean, the victimology in male crimes tends to focus more on strangers, and the victimology in female crimes tends to focus more on intimates. And the means that are used are very different. Men tend to favor things that require more closeness and aggression, like knives and guns. Well, guns don't necessarily involve closeness, but they're more aggressive. And women tend to favor things like poisons and more passive things. And there's a theory that it has something to do with the idea that because of upper body strength and things like that, it might just be easier to that there's a more passive way that might be necessary. And sometimes there's even a recruiting of a male confidant or confederate to help because of the need to move the body, dismember, mutilate, so you can get these kind of perverse alliances between people. But to answer your question, because it's complicated, because if you're talking about a serial killer, we know from the studies that were done at the BSU and onward that there are these fantasies that seem to start, like we see in Heidnik, that go all the way back to childhood, that are about leveling the playing field, right? But I also think in that type of person, part of the idea going through their mind when they take a victim is that that victim's family will be lonely, that victim's family is going to experience that pain of being without. It's like you've inflicted it on another person. And sometimes there are even stories of offenders that are so cruel that they attend the services and things, and they pretend to be a mourner, and they give phony consolation to the victim's family, but they're enjoying it. The power of having chosen the death date for these people, you know. A really good example of an offender who I think enjoyed that twisted thing was Israel Keys.
Yeah.
And Israel Keys would travel all the way from Alaska to bury a murder kit under some random family and then come back years later to kill them with the kit that he had buried under their house. And the idea was that the whole time that family was walking around doing their thing, they had no idea that right underneath their feet was the mechanism of their own death, just waiting for Keys to come back when he felt like it. And so it's like a godlike feeling.
How did he die?
Killed himself in prison, cut his wrist after writing a love poem to the woman who abducted and pretended was still alive by lifting her eyelids open with fishing wire so that he could collect a ransom. He collected a ransom while he was dismembering her and throwing her into a lake. He was collecting ransom from her father. And but you know, and of course, while she was festering in a cabinet for a long time, he was out on a cruise with the family, you know. So, but you want to understand that that part of this has to do with that godlike thing, like your appointed day, you know, that kind of thing.
Where does he rate on your?
Well, there was really no torture, although he engaged in a little bit of strangulation in one case in Vermont, which might be considered like what they call like a non-protracted torture, like Bundy would engage in. So the maximum score for him would be 18, but 17 if he had only committed sexual offenses and murder repetitively without torture. But he's
because it says he was a bank robber and an arsonist too.
It was a psychopath, a complete psychopath. Yeah, and quite intelligent. But you know, but I think what I wanted to emphasize is the idea that, to answer Chris's question, is I think for the serial killer type, the date figures into the fantasy of asserting a domination or control as a way of leveling a playing field against people. Now, Chris, we've talked about that phenomenon in the Kohberger case.
Yeah.
I think the date is important in the Kohberger case too. Maybe we should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, tell everybody when was his birthday? And I mean, I think a lot of people have overlooked this.
Well, his birthday was the 21st, and the murders were on the 13th.
So he had a buildup.
When he committed the murder, he was the same age as BTK when he committed his home invasion and murder, 27.
Yep.
But then 8 days later, he was 28. But it is interesting. I'm not suggesting that was part of the motive. It's just a fascinating coincidence. If he's guilty, that
you just wonder, before his 28th birthday, there he is in correlation in terms of alignment with another serial killer, and he commits these 4 homicides.
Yeah, if he's
And
guilty. Yeah, right.
Dennis killed the Otero family,
4
and
people. Right.
4 people there, and you just wonder, wow, is it a quinkydink, or is it something that in his own mind, and as problematic as that would be and is, I just wonder. It does make you think. It does make you think.
Definitely makes you think. And of course, remember that there would have been precipitating events for Kohberger if he's guilty, right? He was facing the collapse of his TA, the whole TA thing, his academic situation, and I think was very angry at women who were complaining about him. So you did have that classic precipitating thing. For Raider, if you remember, if people want to go back and listen to the first episode of the Witness Box, we talked to Catherine Ramsel, the foremost authority on BTK, and I asked her what the precipitating event was before the Oteros, and she talked about it. That it was job related, and he'd lost some position, and as a consequence, needed to go out and assert this control. So that I think what we sometimes find is that you can't divine the symbolism of the date without knowing the person, because when you discover the offender, you realize that the date had a meaning because it was an anniversary of losing a job, or it was days away from some day that's going to make you reflect on your life, right? Now, here's a fascinating example of this. Melvin Belli, the lawyer, Melvin Belli, who, by the way, was on Star Trek. He was on Star Trek episode, if everybody remembers that. He was a very flamboyant lawyer in California. He got a phone call on December 18th one year at home from a man claiming to be the Zodiac killer and needing his help. And he claimed to Melvin Belli that he was deeply depressed and that it was his birthday, December 18th. Now, interestingly, December 18th is the birthday of the primary suspect in the Zodiac case, who is Arthur Lee Allen. I don't happen to believe Arthur Lee Allen is guilty. But if you do, that is a rather interesting coincidence.
I do.
So you do? You think Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac? Oh, wow.
I do. Yeah.
I don't, but that's fascinating. There's a debate we need to have one day.
I would love it.
And the Lake Herman Road murders, if I remember correctly, were 2 days after the 18th, December 20th, 1968. And that's when the 2 kids are shot in the car on Lake Herman Road, you remember? Which is like the first of the Zodiac killings that are canonical, at least. That's 2 days after the birthday of Arthur Lee Allen. It's interesting, and so you start putting this all together. And by the way, when was Darlene Ferrin killed? 4th of July, right, in Blue Rock Springs. So that you start thinking, maybe these holidays set off these lonely guys. Maybe these events set off these lonely guys. Maybe they think that it'll be an easier time to find a victim because people are out and about, and and they control better. But I think the reason this is so important is it gets to a point that I've made with Anne a couple of times on a few different programs. But I think one of the things that gets missed in the psychology of serial killers, especially, is we get caught up in the sexual, but we miss the point that for a lot of these guys, the key is their unstable attachments, that nobody predictably loved them. And so dates that symbolize that, when everyone else is surrounded by love and friendship and predictability, that every year on the same date, the same thing happens, it to them, it's a spit in the eye. And I think it could be very triggering for some of those people. Don't you think, Chris? It's triggering for people who aren't killers.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it causes me to think about Christopher Watts. I mean, we know what potential motive there was, right, to kill his entire family. But when you think about what was the trigger that caused him on that date to put this thing into motion, was it the girlfriend? I mean, there's all kinds of theories, but there had to be something a lot deeper with him.
Right. Right.
Have
That
you
was
ever? Did
Colorado,
you?
right? Colorado, Chris?
Colorado, yeah, it was
In
August
August. Yeah, right.
August 13th, 2018.
Well,
Yep.
I'm sure if you dug into it a little bit, you would discover that there was a precipitating event. Because if you have a dynamic that drives a person, there has to be that last straw kind of thing. It's either symbolic or it has to do with being like a pressure cooker and something happens that makes you think you're facing dissolution of something, like your wife's going to leave you or you're going to lose your job or you're going to. I mean, Chris, as a human being, all of us have had adverse experiences, terrible things that have happened to us, okay? Did you ever have a time when the holidays came around and it became for you like a moment of pausing and reflecting on where your life is at and what you've achieved? And instead of looking forward to a fresh start, it becomes like a referendum on
Yeah.
everything you lost.
Well, I did that, believe it or not, 2 weeks ago while driving, and I heard a certain song,
Yeah, right.
and it took me back over reflection in my life, and I thought to myself, "Wow, one, I'm not getting any younger, but two, the song that I was listening to just brought back a flood of memories." And to your point,
It's how trauma works.
Was it
Yeah.
Genie in a Bottle by Christina Aguilera?
you chicken beak,
Well, because that that makes me reflect too.
way to go, Smalls. It,
Yeah.
you know, I just lost my train of thought.
Sorry,
you
I'm sorry.
were talking about how you got triggered about some difficult memories by a song, which is it happens to people who've gone through traumatic experiences.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, and I mean, I've got a list, right? I mean, we could talk.
But you're a
could do whole
musician
pod-
too.
I am a
So
musician. Yeah.
so that, I mean, music is something that's very important to you, and you probably, because I'm the same way, where music is, it's therapy, but at the same time it's like you hear a song, you're like, I haven't heard that song in 20 years, and it's like a marker, you're like, oh my
That's right.
god, I'm old, or not, I'm not saying you're old, but
No,
yeah,
it's okay.
you know what I mean. Genie in
I'm
a
not.
Bottle, that was like 25 years ago.
That's a little scary.
Well, I'll tell you the song. The name of the song was "Alone Again Naturally" by
Oh,
Gilbert Sullivan.
Gilbert Sullivan.
Yeah.
I love him.
And I'm driving and I'm listening to this song and I started reflecting on, just life as a whole. And I thought, man, this is a depressing song. I don't want to listen to that song anymore.
Right.
But a little while from now, if I'm not feeling any
yeah,
power,
that's right. I'm climbing myself up to the top.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Well, Dr. Gary, like you were saying, the markers, like if you think of like the song like Fast Car by Tracy Chapman, what a terribly depressing song. It's a beautifully written song, but
Very beautiful.
It goes through just like each marker in the person's life and how they're reflecting, like, I hoped things get better. And I think a lot of people, when I used to manage a sports store back in, I don't know, the 2015, and I had these college kids working for me, and then sometimes I would end up with a buddy who was kind of directionless, who was my age, in his 30s, and I would kind of go, when I would talk to him, I said, like, what are you doing in life, or you're done with college, you're this or that, and a lot of the times I had noticed that they had either become depressed, I thought I would be somewhere else in life. And a lot of them, when I say a lot of them, I know too that, got into drinking and drugs and ended up falling victim to fentanyl overdose because they, were partying. And I remember just thinking, these 30-year-old, 25 to 30-year-old guys, they have no girlfriend, they have no children, they have no direction. If they don't get direction soon, it can be really bad. And I'm talking career or anything like that, and I would just see them around town even after.
It's a referendum.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, and all of us have experienced very painful loss. It's something that binds the three of us together. I think if the good Lord had any purpose in getting the three of us together, it had something to do with that. We're united in grief. And the interesting thing about it is that anyone who has ever been through it knows that it has a way of dividing your life kind of like BC and AD. It's like the fulcrum moment of your life. And every day that came before it and every day that came after are like two completely different eons. And if you've never been through it, you don't get that idea. But like you can't view life through a different lens than the lens of what had happened on that particular day. And I'll tell you, and I'm sure this is true of the two of you, but I can remember the day that I experienced very painful loss like it was yesterday. I mean, that will never leave me. I can still close my eyes and see it as if it was yesterday. I really understand that. And then what happens is I think the human brain is a way of kind of dealing with it, isolates it to a symbolic day or something so that you can move on with life. And then on that one day, you just cry your eyes out or you remember it, because it has to be vented, or you'll just flip. And have you guys had that experience that there's like a thing can kind of it gets compartmentalized and like something can set it off?
Dr. Gary, it happened to me yesterday on Mother's Day.
I was wondering, that must have been hard for you, Mother's Day. Yeah. I don't know if that's what to talk about.
Oh, yeah, I don't mind. And Chris, thank you for inviting me onto the show. I'm sorry I didn't make it, but and I knew that, when I told Chris that I wasn't going to make it,
he would understand it.
He would understand it, and I figured his first question would be, "Are you okay?" Because he knows about, and I was okay. I just, when you were talking about like reflection and dealing with emotion and things like that,
right?
I didn't choose the time of day because I overall it was an okay day. It wasn't terrible, but there were times where we would start talking about my mom and with my grandma, and it would invoke a reaction. And I would say probably 50 minutes before, we got talking. And
but Josh, the audience doesn't know what you're referring to about.
Okay. So obviously yesterday was Mother's Day, and my mother was brutally murdered by my father. I mean, he killed her. He shot my aunt once, right through the back, and she barely survived. I mean, she was in a coma for, days, and then he went after my mother and spent the rest of the bullets there. And, even by her last words, you read it during testimony and stuff. And she asked him, why are you doing this? Which is a reasonable question. And you sit there and think like, that's the last words that somebody, that your mother said, and I grew up dealing with that. And Mother's Day had always been, because it always been a mixed bag, because I did celebrate Mother's Day, but with my grandmother. I never called my grandmother my mother, even though she was nothing but a mother to me and has been nothing but a mother to me. But fact of the matter is, she is not my mother. I have a mother who just happened to pass, or who died many years ago. And so the day of, I know that sometimes Mother's Day is one of those days. Like, for some reason, Christmas doesn't bother me. Thanksgiving doesn't bother me. Her birthday a little bit, but Mother's Day, because I never got to really remember and experience one with her. We only had a couple Mother's Day together. I was so young, I don't remember that. And it's a absolutely triggering day. Now, I'm not a psycho and I'm not a mass murderer, but if I was to do something on that day, I would probably be categorized as, well, Mother's Day is a triggering day. Look what happened to him as a young boy and things like that. But what I'm getting at is, yes, there are certain days that invoke, it just so happens to be Mother's Day, because that is a day. But here is the thing too. And I said this, yesterday on a podcast. I said, Mother's Day isn't about me. It's just not. A lot of people are very sad on Mother's Day. It's not just me. A lot of people have lost their mothers. And so it's a nice day, and it can also be a really dark day for some people. And as I've gotten older, it's gotten better. I've learned to deal with that more. But yeah, there is a certain day. But it was weird too. And I don't know what this is. Like when we started talking, and it, you know, it's a good talk, but then your mind starts going, and then you just kind of start thinking, what ifs and what would I say, or, you know, and that I started cycling through that, and
Right.
um,
There's
Matt,
an old line of poetry by Whittier that says, "Of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been."
yep, yep,
And that always haunted me, that line, because it's true. It's the sitting around thinking what could have been, what could have been, what could have been. But out of curiosity, Josh, in this horrible story you're telling,
mm,
what was the triggering event for your father? Do you know?
yeah. My mother was leaving him. She had been done.
Hmm.
He knew we were leaving. Matter of fact, we had tickets to Seattle. We were flying to Seattle in 2 days,
Hmm.
and we were going to start a whole new life because he had gotten really out of hand, meaning stalking. Um,
Sure.
there was a time I remember this just from being a young lad too. I tell you, we were staying in this apartment. We had my mother and my aunt had told the cops about what was going on, and they basically said, you know, there's nothing we could do. He had threatened her, and this is 88. They said, you know, leave your porch light on. That's what they told her, right? Leave your porch light on. I was like, oh, geez, okay. We all, like a hurricane or a tornado was coming, we all slept in the middle of the room. My mother and my aunt, I remember them both holding really big knives next to him while we were sleeping because they were terrified. Like he would be under the house, he would stalk, he would threaten, you know, the drive-bys. And when he was even confronted with it, when during his parole hearing, even the last time, when they asked him if he was, they wanted him basically to admit that he was stalking, right? And he said, I call it spying. And the parole guy goes, "You call it what?" And he goes, "I call it spying." And he goes, "Okay, well, Mr. Diaz, I'm not here to, you know, to play semantics with you." And he goes, "But I wasn't spying." Or he goes, "I wasn't stalking, I was spying." And he
Sounds
says,
like the
"What's the difference?"
prosecutor in the Kohberger case.
Yeah, well, exactly right. And then they would ask him about the domestic violence because there was that too. And he said, this is how he would frame it. He said, well, it was mutual combat. And this guy is a boxer. He was a boxer in the military, and my mother was 125 pounds, 5'2", and
Was she
you know,
very
he was
beautiful, your
very
mother?
beautiful, very
Was
beautiful.
a trophy to him?
Absolutely. He would have never found anybody as pretty or as
No.
outgoing. I mean, she was the life of the party, man. She was just ev all of the sisters. She had 4 sisters. They were just, and
Hmm.
she was kind of the glue, you know, like that held everybody together. And subsequently, and you know, episode isn't really about me, but when my mother died, when she was murdered, and my aunt was killed, or excuse me, my aunt wasn't killed, but she survived, but just barely. And she has lasting repercussions from that incident to this day, mental and physical. Um, my family fell apart. Like the entire, the only people that really held it together were my grandparents with us, but everybody else, like one of my aunts moved to Germany. One had a mental breakdown. Two of them had a mental breakdown. Excuse me, and the ripple effects. I'm telling you, and
Greg Cooper talks about that,
it's,
about that ripple effect of victimology, right? Right, Chris? About that ripple effect to the whole community and the family and all that.
Yep.
dude. I watched, and it to this day it actually still happens. Like I'll be in the grocery store, and somebody will come up to me and we go, I knew your dad." You know, and I said, "Oh, okay." Not they went to high school together, and you know, I would talk to them a little bit and they would just say, I just never saw that coming, man. I'm so sorry. And
Really?
this is 30 years later. And I
You mean he
say,
could
I
be
don't,
kind of charming and deceptive, that kind of
he
guy?
was all, he was all those things. He was the little league coach. He was the one that got the family together, but he had of, a lot of legal trouble, um,
Wow.
sexual assault, uh,
Oh, I got it.
battery. you know, he wasn't, it still is in my opinion, wasn't a good guy, but
Is he still alive?
he is. Yeah. He was just denied parole a year and a half ago, and he's serving 25 to life. They call that the installment program here in California. Usually when you get a life sentence, they bring you up for parole. But if you're like a murderer, most of the time they hold you back. Most of the time, not all the time, but yeah, his triggering event was the same thing as every other loser husband that can't handle getting dumped because they're a-holes to their wives and family.
That's a little Barry Morphew-esque, if he's guilty. And incidentally, a Mother's Day murder.
Exactly, Barry Moore. That is a great point. My dad told my mother a week before she died that he would cut her face up with razor blades so nobody would ever want her. And you're just going, you're an insane human. I mean, that's just crazy talk.
Michael Stone and I had, you know, we used to keep spreadsheets of all these weird types of crimes, and we had a whole spreadsheet of about 13 or 14 cases or so that were all in the Middle East of men who were rejected, rebuffed by women, and would then throw acid on their faces to destroy them so that no other man could find them beautiful. And it's like this unique kind of offense that happens there. You know, but these women would be like completely disfigured, like kind of like oil vitriol, you know, that kind of thing. Chris, you could just imagine. I bet you've never seen an acid throwing in your police career, right? They're pretty rare. They're awful, really, really awful. But you see, let's say you had to be in a room with your father every day, and you could hold your desire to clock him over and over again. Wouldn't a day like Mother's Day or the anniversary of the event be the day that you finally lost it and clocked them?
Absolutely.
You can understand how that happens to people, right? It's that day that the emotion overwhelms you and the event, you know, and that's where this ties back to talk what happens to the offenders.
I don't even like him talking about her. You know,
I mean, I understand,
but yes, that would be the day, Mother's Day, or the day that she was killed.
It's what we call a particular, right? It's like how we honor our mothers on Mother's Day, but technically we should every day, right? We honor our loves on Valentine's Day, but we technically should. But human beings have a need for the particular, and we pocket it onto one day, you know, symbolic day. And I think it's very, very interesting. Think about that. The Morphew case, I think, really should be looked at through the lens of Mother's Day as an interesting event. Incidentally, the Morphew kids had to celebrate another Mother's Day without their mother and thinking of it as the day that they found out she was gone. You know, and put into their heads that their father may have done it. You know, it was something that you could just imagine. And
he texted her Mother's Day too. He texted her Happy Mother's Day.
Well, but it's a way, isn't it a way of making the day infamous? So that instead of thinking of mom in a good way, it's the day that you hate every minute of the day. It becomes an evil day, right? It's infamous. Instead of honoring the person, it's a day that now is ruined. And I think the key to it is, I was miserable on this day, and now some victim's family, you know, is miserable. They're the ones who are miserable. And Chris, you and I have seen this in the foundation when we dealt with people and people on the program, and they all talk about that, you know?
Yeah. I wonder if Barry set that as a memory for him, you know, meaning Happy Mother's Day, even though we know it's a play, but does he reflect back on that over and over again? Like, I did something good. I don't know.
Well, if he's guilty, I don't think the day is a coincidence.
No, I agree.
You know, it's a spiteful thing to do.
Right. But for him, is that kind of, you know, play into the staging aspect of it, but at the same time give him a sense of, you know, I texted her, you know, one of these things while she was out there with her lover. Right. I don't know, maybe I'm going off the rails here on that one, but at the same time, you know, I mean, who in the world can hunt their wife down? And
if he's guilty, it does look like he did that. He with that BAM, and same thing he would do to animals. I mean, it's pretty disturbing. And on the day that she's supposed to be honored,
Yep.
and unbelievable. Now, Chris, didn't you had an involvement in the JonBenet Ramsey case? That's another day with a symbolic date, right? Because
I did.
it was a Christmas murder, wasn't it?
Right.
How
And
did that figure in?
well, I was contacted by Lou Schmidt back in the day when he was with the Boulder DA's office, and he was called in to take a look at the totality of what was going on there. And he had created that list of numerous, individuals that he wanted to eliminate. And so, because of my training and experience at the time, I got into, a phone call by my supervisor, and he says, "Hey, Boulder's on the line. The little kid out in Colorado, they have some questions about a subject that was out here in Southern California, and they want you to find him, blah, blah, blah." And so that was kind of, I ended up talking to Lou at length, kind of getting homicide 101. What do you have? What do you got? What are you seeing? What are you looking for? Yada, yada. And he gave me a whole bunch of insight. And the one thing that he mentioned even that particular day, and I remember it vividly, and this was long before any of this had ever hit the environment, right?
Right.
It's what they call in homicide holdback information.
Right.
And so he tells me, I ask him, I said, "Well, what's the murder weapon in case I'm running across this guy and he, spontaneously or whatever tells me something?" And he goes, "Oh, it was a garrote." I said, "Really? Tell me about that." He said, "Well, it was a paintbrush broken in half. It was a shoelace." He said, "But the most interesting thing, the ME believes it was applied 4 separate times." And immediately my mind went to autoerotic, fantasy. And I said, "Really?" I said, "Do you believe this is an autoerotic fantasy?" And he said, "Well, we can't eliminate that yet." I said, "Okay, no problem." So
You said that off the bat, which would
right
of
off
course
that, yeah.
would have pushed people in the direction away from the family as being involved. I remember we talked to Anna Salter, Dr. Salter, on
Yep.
one of the episodes. We asked her about the JonBenet thing because we were looking at, I think, Gary Olivia as a suspect or something.
Yep.
And she said, if I remember correctly, she said that in all of her illustrious career of dealing with sex offenders, she couldn't think of a case where a family member would use a garrote on a child in that way. That's a thing that a person with a fantasy based
Yep.
serial quality or something like that might be more likely to do. And I hope I'm quoting that correctly. But Chris, that's really interesting. So then, what would be the meaning of Christmas?
Well, that's a great question, because if it was a stranger, obviously, then, there's a lot of fantasy going on there.
Yeah.
Of maybe she's a present.
Right. Loneliness.
Of loneliness. Right.
And Gary Olivier is interesting as a suspect because he has a lot of these religious ideas about her.
Right.
That she's like a kind of angelic thing. He wanted to eat her like a communion. He first saw her in church, the whole, and who knows if that guy's going to turn out to have any involvement in the case. But it is intriguing to think about that if a stranger was involved, that Christmas could have been an activating day for him, for the same reasons we've been talking about. And somebody's got to do a survey of this, look at the dates that guys go out and kill their victims and their proximity to holidays. I have a strong hunch about it.
Interesting. Josh, what were you going to say?
It's I was thinking of why, was there a correlation between somebody's sexual fantasy, because, she was a pageant girl and she was dressed up and all this kind of stuff. Did she have a pageant that day, or was it like that week or something? And somebody, because I'm guessing that you guys don't believe that the the parents, like you said, because of the garrote, have anything to do with it. And I don't have an opinion on it, and I don't think that they do either. I don't know anything other than, what a tragic case that is. But I'm pretty sure from what I've heard, though, was that she had like a pageant or something like that recently. And I mean, that would just be a breeding ground for perverts, wouldn't you think?
Well, you have to look at it through the lens of, remember, the information, not the person. Okay? Always remember that you look at information. Okay? And what's the information available? Well, the murder weapon's available. You have this, mysterious note that's available. And then you also have, evidence that they pulled DNA out of, that's available. And the one now from there, you reverse engineer it into, okay, well, what's this information telling us? And does it point to any one person and or a group of people? And if so, what type of people are within inside of that, target set?
Right.
And you have to ask yourself, okay, to your point, you have a mother who may be quirky, right? A dance mom, for lack of a better term, or a pageant mom. Okay. But does she have the capability to manufacture a garrote? Okay. I mean, tie a garrote correctly, and then even more worse than that, apply it potentially 4 separate times. And then you also look at the other information. There was evidence that her pajama bottoms potentially could have been inside of that suitcase that was underneath the window.
And that the paintbrush may have been inserted.
Correct. That he was trying to get her out of the window. That was the theory. They're trying to get her out of the window. He didn't have enough, whatever it was, to get him out that window, strength or whatever. And he gave up, and his fantasy took over. Okay. There's also a piece of rope up in her bedroom that's unaccounted for. Nobody knows where this rope came from.
Right.
So,
parents don't do things like that, Chris.
Yeah,
parents don't insert.
I've said in front of multiple classes of homicide investigators, first thing I've ever asked them, and by the way, this case is so passionate that people they fight with you. It's like, okay, great. Maybe we'll both
the Kohberger story of its day.
And, that's why I don't have an opinion about it, because I'm not willing to.
Well, Ann Burgess and Victor Petreka and I have spent a lot of time studying foreign object insertion cases where somebody sticks an object that's sort of a penis substitute or just for some other reasons into the sex organ of a victim. And it is thought, if I understand correctly, it is thought that the paint stick that was used to make the garrote was vaginally inserted. And that is not something parents would do who are staging an intruder coming in and killing their child. That idea, there's that ridiculous theory that the brother did it and they were helping to hide it or whatever. That is a crime that would be committed by a fantasy-oriented, odd, local, sexually perverted person who had probably seen her out somewhere and became fixated on her and then broke into the home, possibly activated by the significance of Christmas. Because it definitely, it might have been that was a day people were like busy upstairs and you'd have some, that kind of thing. Chris, it could have had a practical purpose too, right? Like we were talking about people who pick the day because there'll be more people out or there'll be people that are more busy. Some do it for spite or symbolism, and some do it for the practical reason.
Yeah, and if we look at it, right, Gary, I mean, you and I have been there, done that. Mm-hmm. If we look at this concept of, look at all the infighting that the law enforcement agencies are all engaged in, even to this day.
Oh, yeah.
The fighting taking place. You have the father who's saying, hey, you guys have DNA. Send it off. Okay, we want to know what that DNA says. We've got technology today that they can, pull it off. And what did they do earlier on? They sent it in, okay, And what did they come back with? They came back with, well, yeah, there's something there, but we think it came from one of the workers in China, okay, when they were packaging her underwear. And I mean, and you just sit there and you go, really?
The acrobatics that you've got to do to
Right. It's like,
that story.
oh my gosh, and then all the books and then all the alignments of friendships and all the YouTube channels and those friendships, yada, yada, yada. And the list goes on, and everybody is right. Every one of them. They're all right. But then you ask them, okay, well, then where'd the garrote come from? Who selected the garrote? Was it the father? Did he go down in the basement, manufacture a garrote, and then come upstairs and say, here's my daughter, and by the way, she's got this garrote around her neck? And it was applied multiple times because her hair is stuck in it. And that is very classic. And I think Gebert would, give us a classroom on that, right? That about, erotic fantasy murder. And what was interesting, and the reason I got called, as you know, Gary, is my background at that time. I got sent away, to do the behavior analysis, and it was, I don't know if the audience knows, but my background is criminal behavior analysis in relationship to pedophilia during the commission of homicide. So guys who select children to murder them for sexual gratification. That was the training that I had. And I had a chance to, sit at the tutelage of, at that time, of two FBI agents. One, is a guy named Brown, and then Mary Ellen O'Toole, who Greg brought into the giant. She's amazing. She still is amazing to this day. She's out there. And this was all on the heels of what we've talked about before in San Diego County. We were having all of these, children that were being murdered, et cetera. And the question was, what's going on here? We need to have somebody. And there were a total of 3 of us in Southern California that were selected, and I was from the San Diego area. There was a guy from LA, and then there was a guy from NorCal. And all 3 of us went through the same training. It was other classes too, but that was my focus. That's what they asked me to focus on. That's why I ended up interviewing Dodd. That's why I ended up, with the Brandon Wilson thing and all this other stuff, West Memphis 3, all of those problems that I got,
But you see, Chris, how the good Lord takes a person who experiences loss and then makes them a master of helping other people not have to experience it, because you help those families that are dealing with this, the child missing, child taken from them, etc., and you give them justice. And it's an amazing thing how in the good way, not like the evil way that some of these offenders do it, God has a way of leveling playing fields too.
He does.
It's very interesting to me, right?
And don't the universe is on schedule, right? The universe is on schedule with that, and so But anyway, to wrap up the JonBenet thing, not only in my own mind, I've always believed, and John Douglas came to the same conclusion and told them so. John came to the same conclusion that, look, this is a stranger. You folks need to get out of left field and get into right field. And by the way, one of the things I will tell you, a lot of people don't know this. I consulted and worked with, the Elizabeth Smart's family when she was abducted.
I'm fascinated by that story.
Yeah, Ed Smart, and at the time John Walsh was working with him, and we were asked to do a behavior analysis in relationship to who, what they should be looking at. And so we met with some folks and we told them, look, you guys are barking up the wrong tree. You're over there kicking in doors with Riki. Remember the RSO, that they were convinced he's our guy. Okay? And we were pointing them to the basic science of the victim risk continuum and saying, look, everything is telling you there's something in this environment that this suspect had access to. And we think there was a cross in this environment. So don't go out of this environment unless you can connect him to this house. Don't leave this house yet. And lo and behold, it was the sister who goes, bing. She has an aha moment and says, I know who it is. It was the maintenance guy. And Ed had hired this guy to do some work at the house. And that's when he selected Elizabeth. And that's how that whole thing started to unfold. But in the interim, they had kicked in, Ricky's door, and they were, throwing the belt at him. And I think the JonBenet Ramsey's case is another perfect example of, if you go against that grain in terms of the way the group think, then you know what, you're wrong. You're 100% wrong. Well, that's how crimes go cold. And how long has it been? Right? How long has it been? And here we now are in a time and an age where you can look at this stuff through different types of lenses, and those forensic lenses will not lie. I mean, Samuel Little, remember him, Gary? The serial killer.
But I just want to say quickly about Mitchell and Barzee, the kidnappers in the Smart case. You remember that the speculation was that part of the motive was polygamy, that he was interested in polygamy. And I wonder how many people realize that Wanda's birthday and Elizabeth Smart's birthday are 3 days apart.
There you go.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Very
was
interesting.
November 3rd and one was November 6th.
Yeah, is she a present?
It's like, it just makes you wonder.
Right.
It might be a coincidence, but it's interesting if the idea was to have multiple wives, and that they have birthday one after the other, except one's really young and the other one isn't, right? And it's almost like a weird replacement. It's like when your dog dies and your dog's name is like Snowball, and then you get another dog and you call Snowball 2. Think of people like completely interchangeable, So okay, they got similar birthday, it's like an upgrade, to a younger mod. It's really disturbing, but that's some of these perverse, weird people are. And let me tell you, Mitchell is a disturbed person.
Yeah, he's a puppy.
I have here in my possession part of his diary that was given to me. It was one of the things Michael and I analyzed for the New Evil, and it is deranged. It's just rambling, messianic in tone, really, really weird. And, you would divine from it right away that this was a deeply disturbed person. I always thought if I ever met Elizabeth Smart, part of me would want to show it to her because it would be so interesting. Part of me would not want to, because why, revisit those horrible memories, But so what do you think about this hypothesis that we're putting out here, that when you're doing profiling, when you're contemplating the motive for a crime, that with certain fantasy-oriented people or people with grudges or things like that, that the dates are probably not coincidences? It's interesting, isn't it?
I think it's a fascinating
principle. Let me ask you this, Dr. Gary, because so when the Columbine
about it,
what's that?
I bet nobody else on another podcast is talking about it.
Probably not. When the Columbine shootings massacre happened, which just happened to be Hitler's birthday, and by all accounts,
it was picked.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's what I'm going to say. Why is it that? Why would they pick that day? Just because of the hatred that Hitler, because nothing that they did or do has anything to do with Hitler.
Well, I think it had to do with the idea of mass extermination of people that you consider inferior. I mean, that was the epicenter of of Columbine was a colossal hatred in one of the two boys in particular, who was more psychopathic, where the idea was to sort of level the playing field again, by this time sort of in a warlike way, taking over the school and killing everybody that was inferior to you. It was in your mind. It was seeing yourself like a little Führer that was going to go in and do that. And, you got to understand it that way, that for these people, think of the symbolism of doing something on Hitler's birthday. It's also a way of saying, now when you think about Hitler, that day you'll also have to think of me, right? So I'm a symbol of infamy too, right? Like, and like if you went in Wikipedia and you looked at like significant dates, like you put a date in, it'll tell you events that happened on that day. You'll have these guys separated by just a few decades, well, more than a few decades. You'll have Hitler's birth and the Columbine thing, just a few rows from each other as a significant events on that date. Because for example, people who kill celebrities, like John Lennon's assassin Mark David Chapman, or even to a certain extent John Wilkes Booth. The part of the reason for assassinating people is that you are then bound together forever in history with that person. You Google, like you look one up and you're going to see the other. They're tied together forever, right? So it's like you're a parasite that's taking the other one's fame. And for some people, they parasitically take the meaning of a day. I mean, killing someone on Christmas is like competing with Christ. But that's what they do, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
So it's like we're saying that's going to be my day. Right? That's a special day. For you, it's one kind of special day. For me, it's the anniversary. And you know what the sad thing is? And Chris will tell you this, especially for sex offenders, serial killers. These days that they finally go out and like enact their fantasy is as meaningful to them as something like a wedding day or the birth of a child would be to a normal person. And wouldn't you say, Chris, they keep mementos, pictures. That's why if Kohberger's guilty, Kohberger didn't get rid of that knife.
Yeah, no, he's got it.
It's like getting rid of your wedding ring.
Somewhere.
He's got it somewhere. If he did it, that day had a meaning. And you pick that day like D-Day, and you remember it like the day that you became yourself. And you keep.
And every day his defense attorney argues, he relives that moment with glee inside of him. If he's the guy.
If he's the guy, yeah, we have to. I think it's important to keep saying that. But if he's the guy, and think about how the symbolism of tearing that house down, because it's a way of saying, I have my memories, I have my trophies, and
And he's the only one. He's the only one in that whole courtroom. Right. He's the only one
with a piece
that has the full capture of the totality of the brutality within inside of that home.
Right. And probably some souvenir of it. And Burgess said when the killings happened, even before there was a suspect, we profiled him together. Of course, people could visit. We nailed him on the interview room. If he's guilty, that is some profile. I'm very proud of it. And we said that before there isn't a chance anymore, they need to do a meticulous inventory of everything that people knew was supposed to be in those bedrooms and in that house, because she said something is going to be missing. This person took something as a trophy. And Anne said that in the serial killer study, the number one thing that people took was ID cards, driver's licenses, things like that. I'm sure the symbolism of it is, I took your identity, you belong to me. And you remember what they said Kohberger had in a little box at home?
Yeah, some type of ID
card.
Whose.
But we don't know whose. And but that's very, very important. They should have done an inventory before that house was torn down, because something was probably taken. Don't you think, Chris?
Absolutely. And that's why I was just blown away watching the investigators back up with a van. And then, I don't know if you know this, but they had a special place, and each family had their child's belongings in each of these little partitioned rooms. And oh yeah. And they and I know this for a fact, by the way, this is a fact, okay, that each family was told, okay, this is your room with your kids' belongings. This is your room. This is your room. Go ahead and take what you want.
Oh, how sad.
And each family took what they wanted, which is, fine. But this is the most horrific murder going on ever in the history of Moscow, Idaho. You know what they should have done? They should have packaged every single item and put it in their evidence facility. And at the end of that trial, they could have said, here you go. The court has released all of this evidence. What would you like?
Right.
And you come take what you would want. Because to your point, Gary, they don't know. Nobody, I mean, how many times have we pounded our heads on the table going,
Right.
my goodness, why did you guys do this?
Well, we know that this type of person, if he did it, this is not the kind of person that would have been what some forensic experts call a one and done situation. If he hadn't been caught, this is the type of person whose motivations appear to be more like those of a serial offender, who would have kept doing this and upping the perfection of the fantasy and the expression of whatever psychosexual strivings was going on there. But the idea is, Chris, people like that keep stuff because the day is symbolic. It's symbolic of the day that you conquered, and you've got to carve your initials in the tree somehow, and I've heard of offenders doing things like marking the house in some way so they can revisit it later and remember their territory that they've marked, leaving something there, taking something from it, getting aroused, touching the thing that they've taken. And I am sorry, but somewhere, someplace is that knife.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And
yeah,
and
that's why you would have been pissed about the sheet.
Well, yeah, right. And just think of how many times he manipulated that snap before the murders.
Yeah, it could have happened before the murder. But I told you, I have this weird hypothesis. I've mentioned it a few times, and everyone always says, the DNA could have gotten on there before. But I have this weird hypothesis that this really anxious, obsessional, glove-wearing guy got in there to commit the offense and thought, this part I want to enjoy barehanded, and took the gloves off and possibly left the print, because it would be consistent with what other offenders do.
Yeah,
that you want to experience it in that visceral way without the gloves. And in a very, very, very disturbing way, I once had an offender say to me, I never forget it because it was so disturbing. He said, it's the same reason that I don't like wearing condoms during sex, kills the sensation. So I don't like to wear a glove when I kill. And it always stuck with me, and that's where I got that idea from about taking the gloves off and possibly leaving the DNA. And now that's pure speculation, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
But it could have been before. Could have been before. But incidentally, Chris, on that subject of anniversaries, can you imagine what the holiday season must be like? The Thanksgiving to Christmas season must be like for those families that are still waiting for justice.
Torture.
Awful.
Emotional torture.
It's like a torture. I mean, ridiculous, because that's the whole thing. Dates become hideous to the victims, right? The dates become hideous. Chris, I have stories I could tell about the effects crime has had on victims' families. I'm going to, in the new book I'm doing, the opening chapter talks a little bit about Michael passing, and it talks about the effects on victims and how they need to be the focus. And there is one story I was told, and I had to swear I would never tell who the family was, but it's a very infamous case. Everyone would know it, but I'm not allowed to tell, and I won't. But the story I was told was that this family was horrified that their daughter, naked and dead, the crime scene photo was published in a detective magazine, and the family couldn't bear it. And the mother drove up and down the expanse of the entire state that she lived in, buying up every copy she could find of the magazine that still litters the house to this day, piles of them, because in her mind, every copy she bought was preserving the dignity of her daughter. I mean, think about that. And then you think about Ted Bundy, the Ted Bundy victim, Denise Naslund. Her mother was a very high-strung, neurotic, anxious woman long before her daughter died. And when Bundy killed her alongside, Naslin and Ott were taken the same day at Lake Sam. The mother never moved the daughter's car from in front of the house until the day she died, almost as if the daughter was going to come home and drive it.
Yeah.
Never moved the car. And she said in an interview, every day of her life, every minute of her life, that the words went through her mind in a cycle. How much pain did she feel? Why did this happen? Things like that. Was she calling out to me? Why did this person do this? And it was a loop, an endless loop till the day that woman died. I think she died of cancer. But till the day she died, she fought tooth and nail to get Bundy to admit that he had done it. And she never got her answers. She never got her answers. So, it's funny because we started out talking about dates as symbolic to the offenders, and you wind up talking about how the dates become symbolic to the victims. And I just wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that. And maybe it's
That's the right way to be. And just,
yeah,
whenever God opens a window, he closes a door. And to those victims themselves, I mean, I think that the other torture side of this thing is this idea that he celebrates his birthday at the conclusion, and that date in of itself will, in his own mind, maybe he had some weirdness, connected to that, but those children will never ever be able to have another birthday, another holiday.
You mean in the
I know that feeling as we all do.
Chris, are you talking about Kohberger if he's guilty?
Yeah. So, you know what? This has been a great program today. I think we've made a lot of.
I think they always are. I don't know what it is in the formula.
Yeah.
But I guess when you get three people talking who have been personally touched in the ways that we have and have the kind of temperaments and tendencies that we have and the kind of brains we have, you put them all together, it's always interesting. And wouldn't you guys say? We always
there's certainly a synergy, and then each episode sort of takes on its own form. And I know that we try to outline them, and we do stick to them, but that is what I enjoy the long form conversation, instead of step by step by step. I think that's really what makes it, is what's making it work. And it's everything that we kind of talk about. And I told Dr. Gary this, Chris. I said, I appreciate his passion, and when you attach your name to something, like he is, it means something to him. The same way I feel, and the same way you feel. And I think that has a lot to do with it too. And that we
the artist in us.
The artist in us, but we also have, because I've had conversations with both of you, the compassion and the understanding to know, what we are talking about, even if we're not always correct, we try to handle things with some compassion and care and faith, and
sprinkled
so
with
I think it's great.
The occasional levity, but I think that to me the thing that I love about the three of us is that we're all meaning makers and storytellers. And I think that typical of spiritual people and artistic people, we can take a case like an orange and squeeze it until the last drop of juice comes out of it. Whereas a lot of people are just sort of stuck on it's round and it's orange. We're kind of ripping into it over and over again and making meaning out of it on every level, the philosophical, the spiritual, the psychosocial, and I think that this topic is a classic example of how, if you're willing to go into meaning making, it's very rich in understanding what makes an offender tick and how the offender affects the people that he hurts.
Well, and then another thing too that you guys made the point of, and I thought about this, and I'm sure a lot of people thought about it. Well, I don't know about a lot of people at the time, but just when the Idaho 4 murders happened, I just knew that it was just going to be such a terrible holiday season for those families and forever. And that was one of the first things that actually popped into my mind was going, oh my God, we're so close. They were getting ready to go leave. Everybody was going to go home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it's supposed to be one of the happiest times. My grandmother, she lost a bunch of people during the holidays. Sometimes she struggles with Christmas, and like a lot of people struggle. But that was one of the first thoughts I had was,
Yeah.
I went,
All
oh my, yeah. I said, oh my God. I mean, can you even, I mean, how do you even deal with that kind of grief? I don't know.
But I'll tell you, as somebody who's been through it too, I realized one day, and I don't mean this as a, like to suggest that everyone has to conclude this, because we're all entitled to our mourning. But I realized one day, I remember I was looking at a Christmas card. No, an Easter card. It was an Easter card. And I was mailing out cards to people. And I thought to myself, if I don't really believe what this card is suggesting, then this is all just a fairy tale. But if I do believe it, there is no death. And it really occurred to me that that's when your faith has to bind you. Is you have to remember, right? He that believeth in me, but he were dead, yet he shall live. And that idea has to sustain you. I don't know what people do if they don't believe that. I think they'd go a little mad. But if you believe it, it becomes possible to think of it more like that something isn't gone. A person isn't gone. They're just moved.
Faith is something that I have always struggled with, believing without seeing. And I used to always struggle with that. And
You're a
it
little
was always, what's that?
Okay, I'm going to give you a little help on that real fast, Josh. Okay?
Yeah.
All right, close your eyes. All right. Now,
for the audience out there, he's actually doing it on the screen.
Yeah, this is highly visual.
All right, keep your eyes closed. Okay. Take your hand and touch your left ear. Okay. Is that to the side of you or in front of you?
To the side.
Touch the top of your head.
With which hand?
Either one. Is that above you or below you?
It's above me.
Touch your chin. Is that above or below you?
I don't know.
Okay. Touch your nose. That in front of you or behind you?
In front.
Okay. So I want to ask you a question. You can open your eyes.
Okay.
Where's your I am?
I don't know.
That's faith.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Yeah,
And,
that is interesting.
and you remember when St. Thomas refused to believe that Christ was resurrected until he put his finger in the wounds. But you know what has always fascinated me, and I always wonder how many people notice this. After the resurrection, when Thomas did put his fingers in there and believed, he was the only one who said, "My Lord and my God." He was the first person to call Jesus God. Isn't that funny? The one who doubted the most became the most convinced.
And Christ.
And didn't Jesus want him to do it?
He told him to put his fingers in there.
Touch me.
Right.
For I have not yet ascended unto
Well,
my
that's what he says to Mary Magdalene. But then he lets Thomas put his fingers in to be convinced.
Yeah.
Yeah, and remember that according to the Bible, Jesus ascended to heaven, meaning that when we meet him, he'll still have those wounds.
Yeah. In the Old Testament, remember, he says, I am the beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega. And so that's always a great thing to think about whenever we start to drift from faith, and we always do, because that's just our makeup as the natural man. But always remember, just touch the top of your head, touch your ear, touch your nose, touch your chin, and then ask yourself, where am I? Who am I? Where am I? And where am I going? What is my I am? And at that point, it may be nature. I mean, as you know, I'm out here with the Navajo Nation. They believe in, Mother Earth, Father Sky. And everything around them has significant value to a spiritual development of some sort, et cetera. And so the one thing I love about this program that we're putting together here is two things. One, we are going to have an abundant volume of things to talk about, because unfortunately the crime will never go away. But we're talking about it with this other idea that each of us are exploring inside of ourselves, what this capacity means, and meaning the supernatural side of this as well, because it's not by accident, right? I used to say no man got to the top of the mountain by falling there. And you have to go through this adventure of what is life and what's the purpose of life. Well, you know what? That's why we're here, to kind of figure that piece of the puzzle out. And if we can get Josh to start watching the Padres, we'll be we will be in a much better position with episode 7 and 8.
You can bang on. Well, then episode 7 and 8 are going to be terrible.
Did you see they won 4-0 against the Dodgers?
I didn't see that.
All right.
Yeah.
Anyway, love you both. Have a great evening.
I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. And there it is, episode 6 of the Witness Box. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.